don't think this is a fork in the road. I think we are approaching that point of no return. We are facing the cliff edge, definitely on climate, but also in terms of irreparable damage to our multilateral system. This really is about what we could do, not just in some time, some point in the future or the coming years, but now. It needs to start absolutely now. And we've had a brilliant PhD student called Sabrina who's been taking notes, probably written a PhD on everything we've said. And I think we could really help her out by giving her a few more sort of key takeaways. I don't want to keep you for too long. So I'd really love it if you could focus on your key takeaway from the last 2 days of discussions. That could be either one real theme or one problem to focus on, or it could hopefully be a proposal or a solution. And I'm going to ask everyone to be very brief. I will tell you in advance, I will absolutely prioritize young people and women when I take reflections, because we've had hundreds of years of the opposite. And I will start with you, Alan, and ask you to give me your key takeaways and proposals.
Well, that's a bit of a problem, as I don't fall into any of your categories, being
the first crack at this.
The first crack, and as Richard said, don't hold up the drinks. So I'll try my best not to. But again, I think I do have to thank Mark and Robin, and of course Natalie and the teams from UNA and Chatham House for what has truly been a tremendous occasion. I mean, I'm sure if Kofi was here, and I'm sure he is in a way here actually, it's very clear in all that we've heard, he'd been immensely gratified by this, and in a way it shows that his legacy lives, because it lives in you, and that's the difference. It lives in all of you and in us, and that's the best way to make sure it goes forward. But a few quick reflections, not summary of what happened. I mean, first was the point that came across is the durability of the issues that Kofi dealt with, which will continue. The search for human rights, peace and security, governance, youth, climate change has gone up the agenda, it's true. Opportunity and equality, Africa, UN reform, those issues will go forward. I think, though, what we have to be aware of, they'll go forward and will be discussed in a very changing context for 4 reasons, briefly. 1, demographic change. Africa, as it was pointed out, will be the biggest continent population-wise in a generation. That will change the way we discuss these things, I'm sure. Secondly, economic transformation. The center of economic gravity is moving very rapidly east, and that will again change. The focus on the North Atlantic is already moving, and this will again change the way we move these issues forward, how we deal with them, even though the issues fundamentally will remain in good measure the same. Third, we've mentioned digital innovation. It's incredible to think that when the MDGs were drafted, we didn't have social media. I mean, the change has just been extraordinary, and that will impact everything we do and how we do it. And finally, political transition. We're in the middle, I believe, of a very important political transition, partly caused by globalization, but also caused by generational change. Remember, in in Europe and North America, the generation of the Second World War and what happened after the Second World War is passing. I'm one of them, by the way. And that will change the way we think of things, because memory is relatively short. But it's also happening in other parts of the world. For example, in China. The generation that is now in power and office in China remembers the Great Leap Forward, remembers the Cultural Revolution and all the horrors that went with it. The next generation won't. It'll be better educated, and above all, it'll be urban. So all these changes, I think we have to factor in as we look at tackling these global issues that Kofi tackled in his way, in his day. Second point, we've talked a lot about the golden age, that moment which, yes, true, helped Kofi, but I think we shouldn't see that as the only thing that helped him. First of all, he had the wit to use that time and use it wisely and cleverly. Secondly, it wasn't that golden. I mean, Edward mentioned that the ghost of Banquo was there, namely John Bolton. And he attempted, I mean, let's be honest, to thwart many of what have now become some of Kofi's landmark achievements, including, by the way, his efforts to torpedo the MDGs, the Human Rights Council. And of course, Kofi was able and sufficiently, frankly, clever to be able to go around those obstacles. he was able to find ways forward and this brings me to my third point, and which I think is the most important going forward. Kofi was, above all, what I call a curator of coalitions. He was able to build consensus. And even, for example, with a US administration that in times, especially in the latter part of his Secretary Generalship, was hostile to much of what the UN was about and trying to do, Kofi was able to curate those coalitions that made progress possible. And I think that's, whether it's the current Secretary General or others going forward, if we can't build those coalitions, and they're not just about coalitions of people who agree with us, that is extremely important in the climate change debate. You have to be able to address and convince people who are in Mr. Trump's base, the unemployed miner in West Virginia. If you don't do that, then we will not be able to make the changes we need to do. So building those coalitions of change, I think, was one of Kofi's greatest successes, and was able to take him forward and take the UN forward, and able to, circumvent many obstacles. Let me give you a quick example of that, and that was the MDGs is rightly put down as one of Kofi's greatest achievements. But the MDGs didn't start on the 38th floor. Mark's sitting there, he knows that very well. It started on ideas outside of the UN in a way, at least the 38th floor. What Kofi's genius was to spot ideas, find ways to mature those ideas, not necessarily in the mainstream of the United Nations. He took his time, he matured them, then brought them into the United Nations and made sure that there was an international consensus that would take them forward. Contrast that, the success of the MDGs that have been lauded, and rightly so, with the fate of the Agenda for Development, which preceded it by, 3, 4, 5 years, which was meant to be the great UN plan for the future for development. It was a complete flop. Very few people here have probably read it or even heard about it. Everybody's heard the MDGs. Why? Because that was a thing written within the UN by a committee, and it was a failure. It didn't touch anybody. Was the MDGs came in initially through another initiative. Mark and Kofi presented the predecessor work at ECOSOC in July 1999. And from that was then built into the MDGs. So finding a way to build those coalitions, to bring the ideas into the UN mainstream, I think is extremely important. And he did it with 3 qualities, in my view: patience, persistence, and participation. And that is the way I think he was able to build those consensus over time with the help of many of the brilliant people who we have around us today who've been speaking. And I think that has to be the way forward. He wanted to go forward in the same way. He believed very much in bringing people into the process through participation, but he was also very patient. He chose his moment. Timing was very, very important. I don't think we should ever forget that. But he was also persistent. He kept after things. He took the time when he needed to make a tactical retreat, he would do it, but then come back and again start and make sure they push forward. That has to be the essence, in my view, of Vision Annan as we go forward, which is what the Kofi Annan Foundation, and by the way, our board member is here, Nana Annan, as we go forward. We must build on that. The vision of Kofi Annan and the vision Kofi Annan must be about the future, but it must be about building those coalitions, because Kofi said always, we have the experts, we have the expertise. What's lacking is the political will. And we have to together, and I think the foundation in its modest way can help build that political will that will make these great changes necessary, make them not only necessary, but possible. So just some thoughts to get you going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annan. I mean, I think you've weaved in so many of the themes we touched on today. I'm just going to, before I open it up, and I want everyone to get thinking with their recommendation, can I ask you to give me the one key focus that the foundation will take, going forward? If you're doing your strategic plan just for the next year, I mean, you've got to pick your moments, but unfortunately, I don't think we have the luxury of time at the moment on so many issues, including this panel session. But if you could just be very, very brief and just give us the one key thing that the foundation will really focus on over the next 12 months.
Well, yes, that's a good point. I think we will focus on trying to build those political coalitions, and particularly in the area of democracy and elections, and of course, the pushback for multilateralism. I think that's really vital. And we haven't talked that much about governance, but it is critical. Civil society has an extraordinarily important role, but no successful state in history has been run exclusively by civil society. And particularly in Africa, we need to build those capacities for government, for governance, but in a democratic and a free and fair manner. So that will be our principal priority.
Thank you. Opening it up now. So at the back there, I'm going to take a few. I'm trying to fit in as many as I can. So there, 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 and there. Just take everyone.
Thank you. I thought I might have a bit of time for other people to go first, so I could sort of not be the one that was gonna. I don't know.
You're
I'm
young and female, Kate.
That is true. Yeah. Okay. I've got to own that. Yeah. I think I'm going to offer an opportunity of, and maybe not optimism, and certainly not in a way that would undermine or under-assess the threats that we're all facing and have talked a lot about over the last few days. But if you ask young people in the UK today, aged 16 to 35, to think about their identity, they will tell you that they feel British, they feel English, Welsh, or Scottish, but they also feel European and they feel part of a global community. If you ask people over 60 the same thing, they feel English, Welsh, and Scottish, they feel British, they don't really feel European or part of a global community. And so for all of the amazing things that I have heard over the last few days about this golden era of internationalism, multilateral it might have been, but it was still kind of an elite project. And so maybe there is an opportunity here that the status quo of young people is shifting. It's not just young people in the UK who are changing. It's actually a global phenomenon where young people feel part of something international. And so if we in this room, if the UN, can kind of harness that energy, then I think that is an enormous opportunity. Because in the UK, and I think the UK is a really good example of this regression from, visible regression from internationalism.
Okay, so what are we not doing now that we should be doing? I want to get one.
Okay, so my recommendation is that if we're talking about political will and coalitions, that's the opportunity and that's the target audience. And so whether it's donors talking about messaging, whether it is us in this room thinking about bringing in far more diverse voices in a more creative way that speak to that overwhelming majority of young people who want to be part of a world, feel it as part of their identity, but currently don't have a way of expressing that. They don't have a way of expressing their solidarity. I think then that's something incredibly powerful, and I don't see it very often. Maybe some creativity in the internationalism of the climate change debate that we can kind of build on, but we don't really see that very often. So I think there's a huge space there. And yeah, we don't always need to focus on the tide of challenge. There's actually an enormous tide coming of, I think, support for internationalism. That is a status quo argument that I don't think was the case in the 90s.
Thank you. Ben from UNA UK. I'm going to keep it brief. I think for me, the theme that's come out of the last 2 days is we need to make the UN relevant to all, but it feels like the other side of that coin is that to make the UN relevant to all, people need to feel like they own the institution. And right now, we're seeing civil society participation thematically on issues like SDGs, on issues like the 1 for 7 billion campaign that we heard about earlier, but we're not seeing civil society feed into the actual institutional sort of mechanisms of the UN system, the actual intrinsic, the way that organization works is a conversation that's relevant to civil society. So if I were to suggest one recommendation, we've heard about dozens of programs and funds that are stuffed full of member states. What about a new UN body that shadows, for instance, the work of the General Assembly that's made entirely of the public and civil society? Thank you very much.
Thank you. James Kariuki, Director of Multilateral Policy at the FCO. And before that, part of Jeremy Greenstock's team in New York, the EU negotiator for the 2005 World Summit, so I know about the MDGs and John Bolton, and a member of UNSCOM in Iraq in the 90s. So I've heard a lot today about the problems of governments, including the P5, and in particular the UK, for our detachment and weakness and distraction. So I think what I'd like to say is we haven't gone away. We are engaged. We are spending quite a lot of time talking to our counterparts, whether they're the P5 I hosted in London 2 weeks ago, or the European members of the Council I'm meeting in Warsaw later this week. We are working very hard to try and get things over the line, or advance them, or shift them to move the dial. And it's tough out there, it's difficult. And not only because of what's happening in this country, but because of what's happening elsewhere. So my kind of takeaway would be, you do need critical friends. When Mark Mallet-Brown was administrator of UNDP, he was getting a lot of money from Claire Short and Gordon Brown, and they were really critical of his running of the programme at the same time. And I think that the important thing is that we support the UN and we stand up for the UN, and we will do that, but also we can speak honestly and critically when we need to do that as well. So obviously we're going to have a little bit of change in the UK political system between July and September. So me and people like me will be spending some time briefing some new leaders on the approach we want them to take to the General Assembly in September. And my takeaway from this is that we need to brief them and coach them to be good critical friends. Thank you.
Tina.
Tina Micklethwaite. I worked for the United Nations for a long time in public information, and it's a very simple question, Alan. What can we do to help the foundation? What do you need?
Actually, my takeaway is my take-in. We assess in the European Union that all countries in Africa require about 20 million new job places each year. Now only 2 million are being created, mostly by China for Chinese workers. So I'm coming here actually with thinking about reduction of poverty, but you know, we are not able to do it without creating job. It's not malaria, it's not dirty water which kills most people in Africa. It's unemployment, unfortunately. And my takeaway, which is take-in, is die hard with poverty. Thank you.
If we can do the final question over there to the woman who's going to be writing all of this up.
Thank you. Sabrina White, University of Leeds. One thing that really crops up to me from all of these discussions about building closer relationships and harnessing the capacity between the United Nations secretariats and civil society organizations is that there's an opportunity for these groups to work together on one topic, which is a bit of a bad press thing, I think, for the UN and for the development community, which is sexual abuse and peacekeeping. So where we're at the stalemate at the level of the nation state, I think that this is a wonderful opportunity for civil society, for NGOs, and for the UN Secretariat to do some in-house work that fulfills some of those aims of collaboration on security, on human rights, and on development. And I think that fundamentally acknowledging that is a very practical step that could be taken forward that can also lay the groundwork for some of those networks and coalitions to work together more efficiently.
Thank you. Oh, of course.
I just want to say a big thank you. I think for us, the family, these 2 days, using Kofi's word, amazing. Kofi loved to bring together brilliance and brilliant people, and I think we have really been, it's been wonderful days to hear all of you. He thrived with you. You were a team, and this is our extended family. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Ruma, and their teams for this. For us, it has been very emotional. And as Strive said, he has such a bandwidth, Kofi. And we have seen so many facets of that bandwidth that you have been able to illustrate, and what he was. It came from his heart, it came from his mind, and he just worked on it daily, weekly, year by year, and it continues in the foundation. And I was very proud of the foundation, how the young people there stepped up to the plate when he passed, and with new initiatives on the elections in the digital age. We saw the young lady in the Extremely Together program, which is also a very, very forward-looking program. So thank you, everybody. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. I think that's the perfect note to end on. So I don't want to treat those comments as questions, but we do have writing everything up. What we're going to do is produce a report. It'll reflect the 2 days of discussions, but we will really be looking ahead. So we'll try and really look back at our notes, tease out the recommendations, and to put that in a bit of context, how we're going to take things forward. So next year is not just the UN 75th anniversary, it's also Chatham House's centenary. And I know that Chatham House will be looking at inclusive global governance, very much a strong theme over the last 2 days, and emerging challenges. So I'm looking forward to working with you as UNA UK on that. In terms of UNA UK, we've been doing some of the discussions we've been conducting with our partners in lots of different countries. We're working with 700 or so NGOs to conduct a consultation really on the question I posed at the beginning: what would Kofi do next? What are the most transformative next steps that we need to take in the context of time running out and the decisions we need to be taking in the coming months? And we are trying to focus on, I think, 4 deficits that were really reflected in our discussions: the leadership deficit, the communications and narrative deficit, the democratic deficit. So how do we bring in all these actors who are working in this stubbornly state-centric global governance system that we have? And the solidarity deficit. I'm glad we had comments from, I think, Comfort and Kumi and Mark Sussman actually on the fact that, the 90s really weren't the golden era for a lot of people. And we still see that solidarity deficit within the UN and global governance system. So those are some of the areas we're going to focus on. And of course, we're going to be campaigning on them. And our aim is to produce something like a civil society agenda for UN renewal, we don't say reform, for the 75th anniversary next September, where we want to try and have some of these sort of concrete little steps that will bend the sail, move the dial, whatever you want to call it. For example, a high-level representative for civil society, if not a whole agency. Some things that would really send a powerful signal that the UN and governments are listening, and also that will help some of those voices that for many reasons haven't been able to be as forceful and defend the values as they maybe should have been. I'm grateful to James for his contribution. I think for all we're lamenting the loss of influence of the UK, it is still an incredibly privileged, an influential player at the UN. We want you to do more. We expect you to do more. And UNA UK will keep badgering you about that. So I think some of the other things we want to do is really look at the bigger picture questions. So if you look at the SDGs, it's a wonderful vision for the world, but there's a missing element. And that is, what do we do with IFIs, global economic governance, global governance? That's the sort of missing part of the puzzle that we haven't really got to. And I think, lots of people have said it's a difficult time, but I don't think we should be shrinking our ambition at this time. If we've learned anything from the move towards the right in politics, is that if you cede ground, if you let people direct the tone and set the agenda, it's really, really, really difficult to claim it back. So we need to come out fighting, or swinging rather. I think fighting is a little bit too, not quite the UN word we want to use. I think the next years will be absolutely crucial, the next months. I've just heard from Jamie Drummond at the One campaign that they're really starting to think about doing another sort of Drop the Debt, Make Poverty History style campaign. We still have our 1 for 7 billion network, so I hope we can work with all of you and trying to generate that kind of grassroots engagement for the UN. It is there. We're very skeptical about it, but it is there. Whenever we ask people, they get, especially young people, that we do need the UN to solve all these problems. And we need to end now. So all I'm going to do is thank all our speakers, particularly the Deputy Secretary General for coming here with a broken foot. I will thank our sponsors, the Gates Foundation and OSF, Open Society Foundations. I'll thank all of our partners again, the Kofi Annan Foundation, the UN Foundation, the Elders Crisis Group, Mo Ibrahim Foundation, AGRA, and of course Chatham House. Thank you so much, Robin, Ruma, and Chanu. You've been absolute stars and a pleasure to work with. And thank you, Nan and the family, for being here. It has just made this event so special. And Mark, thank you for corralling us all and getting us here in the first place. Thank you. And thank you all for being so patient. Drinks are upstairs where you've had coffees and teas and lunch. Thank you very much.